Chapter 16, Ministry, Ruts, and Little Man Number 2. Now that you have a good idea of the general direction I was headed in my thinking, I guess we can call it that, I suppose you won't be surprised to hear how defeated I felt each day. It actually bothers me to type that or speak that today. It bothers me mostly because I believe I should have been stronger. I look at men who endured things like the Great Depression, World War II, Korea and Vietnam. Then I look at what happened to me, and it doesn't feel very good. Some may say I'm being too hard on myself. Maybe, and maybe not. That's what I see when I look back. Since I'd settled into a rut, I felt I was continually attempting to climb out. I also know that the difference between a rut and a ditch is how deep and how long they are. It can be far too easy to confuse those two, and I was beginning to feel like I was in a ditch. But was I? The world might have labeled it depression. I've seen enough to know there are definitely different degrees of depression. This is not a condemnation of any of them. I would never offer that I'm educated or capable of defining true depression. What I have noticed is a tendency to seek an easy alternative. A quick look back in time shows that people have endured many trials much more difficult than anything I went through. Since they didn't have anyone offering them a label, they just worked through it. I always believed the social structure around most people in the past was stronger than what we often have today. I realize each life, family dynamic, and situation is different, but our lack of social interaction has an impact that we simply cannot measure. I truly do wonder how many people who are in an emotional rut could be helped out if their social situation were different. Basically, how many mildly depressed people would feel tremendously better if they had a close friend or two to confide in. I could spend a lot of time on that point, but I trust you're following me. You may agree or disagree, but I hope you see where I'm coming from when I say those things. I feel I've been in a place in my life that I'm somewhat qualified to speak to people that are considered to be depressed. I have been there. I'll cover the treatments that I sought out later. Around this point, I went to a friend who was a nurse practitioner. I'd known her for years. She was a customer during the landscape years. She's simply one of the sweetest souls God has ever created. We had a long conversation at my appointment, and she listened to me explain my current situation. She said something to me that I'll never forget. I guess it was quite apparent that my self-esteem was less than what it once was when she'd truly been around me a lot before. I remember her scooting her chair right in front of me so she could look into my eyes. As she seemed to stare into my soul, she said, "Todd, you need to get something through your head right now. You are a wonderful person. You are not junk, because God doesn't make junk." Now, she had a German accent, so it was really sweet, and I can still hear it today. And with very little effort, I can still hear her saying that to me. I told you she was a sweetie. I wish I could say I walked out of there a changed man, but I wasn't, yet. But that obviously had an impact on me. I'll never forget her, the way she genuinely cared for people, and her spunky spirit. She's a very special lady to me, and to many others. So with that in mind, it's time to challenge you a little again. Have you ever experienced someone in healthcare that was over the top special? I hope you have. I've heard stories of doctors and nurses that made all the difference in someone's recovering and moving on in life. Sure, they may have had knowledge in their brain to assist in healthcare, but their greatest asset by far is their heart and love for people. Even though they see hundreds or possibly thousands of patients, wouldn't a kind word be nice? Now you know it would be. So if you're able to offer that kind word to them, will you? Will I? Life isn't about the number of days we live. It's about how we choose to spend the days that we're given. This is a point in time when I bounced a lot from job to job. I was seeking a place of peace, but also somewhere I had a decent future. I could spend hours looking back and changing things around, but that's not a fair thing to do. Why? Each of those choices we make, both good and bad, change who we become. If I went back and changed some of the jobs I worked, I'd also remove any relationships formed and lessons learned along the way. It's been more than 20 years since most of these events took place. To this day, I have true friendships that will last the rest of my life because of those choices. As I've said before, and I'll say it again, God truly has watched over me. I believe that. In 2002, I was working for Travis Construction. Al had stopped by a job site that I was working at when I worked for Illini, and he told me that if I ever wanted a job, just to look him up. So, after a few months at Illini, I decided to take him up on his offer. This was also the only job I worked where I stepped on a nail. Ouch! That one hurt for quite a while. I had decided I wanted to pursue my landscape work a little more than I had been. I was settling down a little, and landscape work was what I knew best. I simply felt at ease doing it, and I wanted to do it more. So my days were filled with building a home with the guys at Travis and landscaping on the side. Luke continued to grow, and Julie and I rolled through life. So, what happened next? If you recall, we had to wait a year or more before we received the news that Luke was on the way. There was no waiting this time. We found out in late 2001 that Julie was pregnant again. It continued to be quite a time in life, both in my day-to-day and also in the world around all of us. I should have mentioned them long before now, but Julie's grandparents, Doc and Katie Houchin, were a huge part of our lives. With no grandparents of my own here locally, I watched their relationships all around them as grandparents. The way they hosted so many family events at their small home was very special to me. We were there almost every Sunday after church, and definitely at every holiday like Easter and Christmas. I had never experienced two people welcoming me into their family the way Doc and Katie did. They were very special to Julie, and it didn't take long for me to see why. Did I mention that Grandma Katie sewed Julie's prom dress our senior year? It amazed me that anyone could just take some fabric and make it into a beautiful dress like that. Still amazes me today. Actually, it wasn't something I saw them offering all the time. It was something that they just were. They were always giving it to other people. And it was something I felt because of the way they treated me. I miss them very much. So what does that have to do with Julie being pregnant? We were old school, as with Luke, and I didn't want to know whether it would be a girl or a boy. If it was a boy, his name would be Jack Daryl Bettis. Julie's grandpa had gone by Doc since World War II, but his actual name was Daryl. If God gave us a boy, we wanted his middle name to be Daryl, after her grandpa Doc. There was plenty of turmoil all around us, as I mentioned. Any American remembers September 11th, 2001. If you were alive and old enough to remember that day, I bet you can tell me where you were when you first heard about the Twin Towers. We had that going on in the world around us. And on an intimate level, Julie's grandpa Doc had passed away that winter before he ever got to meet his next grandchild. Since we didn't know if it would be a boy or a girl, we didn't announce the names. I still remember Julie telling her Grandma Katie our new baby boy's name. Grandma Katie had a sweet side, but she was a tough girl, raised on a farm. I can still see her trying to hold back her tears as Julie shared our surprise. Well, she didn't win that battle with those tears, and neither did Julie. Despite many things that I did wrong and barriers I placed in front of myself, there were some lifelong beautiful moments like those too. That was definitely one of them. And on March 14th, 2002, Jack Daryl Bettis was born. How could any man believe he could ever deserve such a blessing? as his child being born. Whew, what a day. I promised you I'd be very real about my disorder and how it works into everyday life. I'll continue to do that so there's an understanding of how powerful it is. Someone in my state of mind could easily find ways to work it in. It wasn't really that hard. I want you to see them so you can spot them and not applaud someone who needs help. If we just take the time to truly look, it's not difficult to see things on the surface. One aspect of the day of Jack's birth, I don't think I've ever told anyone, so I'll offer it now. Since Julie had to have a cesarean section, we chose the day that Jack would be born. Those planned surgeries are scheduled early in the morning. I still remember the doctor telling us that we had another baby boy. Once we were through all that, Julie was doing well and Jack was resting too. I had absolutely nothing to do. So please tell me that you remember how much sitting around and resting was not allowed. Luke was being taken care of, so guess what I did? If you guessed, went on a long walk. You're right. Gold star for you. Once again, there's nothing in the world wrong with a long walk, but there isn't much right about it either if it's done for the wrong reasons. There were calories to burn, and sitting was almost evil in my mind, so I walked. I walked most of the way across our town, actually. I don't recall the route I took, but I do recall the place I told myself to turn around. Even in the middle of the disorder, I sometimes came to what was left of my mind and my senses and snapped out of it for a short period of time. That usually led me to feeling even more like a failure. Yikes. This stuff really isn't fun to share. But you get the idea. So please, let's move on. I mentioned job balancing earlier. I won't go into details of the tragedy that happened shortly after Jack was born. I was working for another local contractor who was building a house in town about 45 miles away. As I seem to keep saying, it was a difficult time for me, and I certainly wasn't making things any easier on myself. To limit travel, we would travel up and stay for the week. We actually worked 4 days a week, since they were 10-hour days. That gave me 3 days a week home to landscape for the extra money. There was a camper on that property up there, but I chose to sleep in the basement of the house that we were building. I should have been home with Julie and the boys. I was just lost in so many ways. Too many. Occasionally some of the guys would travel home through the week for different reasons. Most of the time we stayed up there though. After one trip home, 3 of them headed up to the job site before dawn. Since it was about an hour drive to the job site, we usually left early. The young man driving fell asleep at the wheel. One young man in that truck lost his life in the wreck that morning. The owner of the construction company was paralyzed in the lower half of his body in that wreck. It affected us all very deeply. For me, it was one more tragedy that just seemed to be all around me. Now let me be very clear. I was the least affected by that terrible morning. I worked daily with that young man who had lost his life. I watched from a distance as his family grieved. The owner of the company was a very good friend of mine then and continues to be today. It took me years to really talk to him about those days. And the time I finally did, I had squatted down by the car he was in. We were in the parking lot of a local retailer where I was working. Once we began talking, I just couldn't handle it. I remember it very well. It was so emotional for both of us. I kept pushing and looking for a foothold in my life. There were times through those years when I truly received the blessing of working for some great families. I'm incredibly fortunate to call them my friends to this day. There are 3 families I worked for, and all of them have deep family roots in our community. The first one I worked for more than once, but I'll cover the first time that I was there. I've always been a big believer in giving the person you're working for a good day's work. Maybe you remember my first day of landscaping and cutting down that hedge. I was afraid that day to tell Brad that it was me who did that extra work and someone else got the credit. I doubt if any of us can grasp what it will be like out in the workforce when we're young with no experience. There absolutely are some awesome relationships that form in our day-to-day lives. There's also another dynamic that comes into play. This dynamic comes in two forms. Let me explain. Some people in a workplace want to get things done. Some of them pile on a little show and expect some attention and/or compensation. Still, they show up to work, and then they actually work. The second personality feels threatened when others show up to work and work. That can be a train coming down the tracks, and if we simply stare at the light, it will knock us down and destroy us too. That was a concept I hadn't been taught, and doubt many people are taught at all. I had encountered a little of it in some team sports, but this was work. Doesn't anyone just show up and try to do their best so they can be proud of themselves and go home to their families? Well, that's what I thought. Boy, was I in for a lesson. Remember, I've always mentioned those analogies about trains. Yeah, I was standing on the track, staring at a little light in that dark tunnel. I had no idea what was coming at me. Working in a new environment can be difficult. The issue of changing to appease others had fallen squarely in my lap. May I explain, please? At one of the businesses where I worked, the employees carried radios. If a customer needed assistance, the girls at the checkout counter would get on the radio and tell anyone listening about the need. Of course, the boss and manager has radios on their desks, so they would contact people and keep track of things. When I was new there and learning the ropes, if someone needed help, well, I helped. That's the way things work, right? Well, I sure thought so. If I were the customer, that's the way I'd want it anyway. But remember that train? It seems I must have answered the radio calls too often. I guess they felt I was showing off. They is always an interesting group. That group is difficult to identify because they scatter like cockroaches when the light shined on them. A few good-intentioned people tipped me off to the issue they were presenting. So what did I do? I decided I didn't want to rock the boat. I'd allow someone else to answer the radio request. But guess what? Rarely, and I mean rarely, would anyone else answer. I wasn't about to leave the customer waiting. I decided that doing the right thing was taking care of the company and the customer, even though I'd always felt that way before. If that ruffled some feathers, well, then I was going to ruffle some feathers. But you can't stop a train like that. I'd do it the same way today, though, if I had to do over again. One individual in particular had it in for me. I received a few nicknames while working there. I was Wonder Boy at times. When something needed done, this individual would say, "Mr. Everything will be up shortly and get it." You get the idea. Why do adults act like such children? Goodness, children aren't even allowed to act that way. The character assassination grew worse. There were accusations made about many things that were very personal. I had a fantastic relationship with the owners and my boss. The problem was, so did the coworker that was causing all the problems. How bad did it get? One day, I was quite distraught. It was bad. I reached out to my pastor over my lunch hour and asked if I could stop by. Pastor Brett was, and still is, a very dear friend of mine. I met him on his front porch. He was somewhat aware of the issues, but they were now at an even new and higher level. So what advice and guidance did he offer me that day? He said, "There's very little I could do about slander like that. It wasn't criminal, just cruel." He said, "Todd, you can spend your life building a reputation, and one person with one lie can make the whole thing shaky and unstable. You have to show up every day just to prove them wrong. No, it's not fair. If it's more than you can take, well, there's really nothing you can do about it." I knew he was right, but what should I do? I went back to work that day. I had discussions face to face with the owner and bosses. They understood, if it continued, I was going to leave. A short time later, I left. I refused to live like that. There's a bit of irony that happens down the road a few years after I left, but I'll cover that later. For me, it was time to move on. Again. I certainly didn't plan it out like this. I thought I'd found a home. By this time, my past life and dreams of owning and running a local landscape business seemed worlds away and like a completely different lifetime. At one point in all the shuffling, I went to work for the city of Olney. Yeah, I kind of laugh a little bit when I say that, because it was a short stay. There was plenty of work to do, great benefits, and the hours were nice. So what happened? Several years ago, our city workers unionized. I won't waste your time telling you about my opinion of that. This story will tell you enough. The city manager actually called to hire me. After a few weeks of working, one of the guys sat me down for a little talk. Why? Well, it seems the guys were getting together and discussing the fact that they thought I worked too hard. Yep. Go ahead. Read that part again. I'll wait. I sat across from a man that I'd known for years who told me this. Todd, you need to slow down a little. The guys say you're making them look bad because you work so hard. Now, what do you think my reaction was? Do you remember my last job? I told him, well, that's too bad for them. I have to go home each day and look at the man in the mirror. I have to look at him and know I gave the city a good day's work. I was sorry they felt that way, and I wasn't trying to make anyone look bad. If they felt that I was outworking them, well, work harder, boys. You see, that's not my experience in a union. Y'all have to stick together, even if they are lazy habits. Did I quit? Well, I didn't have to. That same city manager who hired me asked me to come to his office. I had worked 1 week shy of 3 months. Did that matter at all? Well, at 3 months, I would have officially become a member of the union, and at that point, the union got involved, and it was hard to get rid of me. But one thing I've always found interesting is I had to pay my union dues from day one. I wasn't in the union until 3 months in. What's that all about? In that meeting, the manager told me that I had been the last one hired and they needed to do some cutting back. I looked him squarely in the eye. He couldn't even look at me. Man, was I hot. Are you kidding me? Honestly, I knew I could get another job, but it was just the principle of the thing. Men without backbones bother me a lot. I'd better get on to something else. So what did Julie think about all this? Believe it or not, are you ready? She was thrilled. Yes, she was. She could see what it was doing to me when I was being told to slow down and do less. She knew I was miserable, especially emotionally. I will say, though, I did know it was for the best. But it still hurt. I've never been released from a job or team or anything in my life, except that job. I knew I was being forced out, but it still hurt, no matter how mad it made me. During this time in my life, I knew I needed a foothold. I needed something to help me steady myself, clear my vision. During one of my appointments with that tremendous and kind nurse practitioner, she told me she wanted to make a call for me. She had a friend, a psychiatrist, who she wanted me to talk to. Back in the Pineco days, if you'd told me I'd be seeing a psychiatrist in 4 or 5 years, I would have laughed at you. I was very reluctant still, but I was almost desperate too. I had exhausted myself and all of my ideas. I made the call and booked an appointment. I went to see him weekly for about a year. I'm mixed on the whole thing, actually. Looking back, it just seemed more like he was someone to talk to, and not much on giving advice or direction. Maybe that's not fair, and maybe that's all he was supposed to do. He eventually told me he had done all he could, and I walked away. He was a nice man, but I don't know how much it actually helped. I want to include 2 things that occurred during this time period too. Before I went to see him, my nurse practitioner wanted me to try some antidepressant medication. I was very reluctant. Very, to say the least. In fact, the first time she convinced me to try them, she wrote a prescription. I was scheduled to see her a month later. I took the prescription from her, but I never even got it filled. When I showed up for the next appointment, she asked how it was going. I had to tell her I didn't get it filled. She loved me, and she was very disappointed in me. I could see that. Eventually, I did get it filled, and I took them. Now, I'm not claiming anything medical here at all. I'm not qualified to do those things. This was simply my experience. When I was on them, my head was foggy. It was like I was fighting off sleep most of the day. Now, I'm an active guy. Goodness, that's what those union guys held against me. I did not like the feeling those meds gave me. I decided I would have to step it up a little and do things without those meds. The other thing I tried was a different form of therapy. There was a local doctor who did hypnotherapy. Yep, he hypnotized me. I was desperate enough to give it a shot. I only went once because it was very expensive. Would you like to know what he told me after just one session? Maybe you remember me mentioning my love for Diet Coke a couple of chapters ago. I told you I'd come back to it. After one session being hypnotized, they woke me up. The doctor looked at me and said he felt I should do two things as soon as I possibly could. Please remember, I have no idea what I told him while I was under hypnosis. He told me to stop drinking Diet Coke. That was first. Okay. Then came the second thing. Do you have any guesses as to what it might be? Remember the title of the book. He told me to do whatever it took to get rid of red. Whoa. Really? I don't even remember mentioning red at all. He gave me some information on a dermatologist in Springfield who did laser surgery and a huge pack of papers on how terrible Diet Coke was for me. Diet Coke had become a crutch, and I knew it. I believe it was because Brad and I used to get one first thing every day when things were normal in my world, when things were still on track in my life, you might say. Just heading to the convenience store to get one seemed relaxing to me. I knew I shouldn't feel that way about a fountain drink, but it seemed the only thing from those days that I could still just go get and be normal. You already know I'd been down the road of birthmark removal. I wasn't ready to consider that again at that time, so hypnotherapy was a decent experience, but nothing came of it. I still find it incredibly interesting that he mentioned red, though. I have no idea what I told him, and I kind of wish I did. Life was rolling along, and I had more blessings than I realized at the time. I wonder how many people can say that along with me. I believe all of us can in some way. With all my life being spent with red and now my new disorder along with me, it seemed like the rut I was in was a complete ditch. I didn't spend every day discouraged, though. If you feel like your rut is a ditch, please don't give up. How can I say that? Well, it's one of the reasons I'm writing this book. I wasn't in a ditch. My rut had an end. Of course, there's more coming in the following chapters about how that happened. But before I get into the next chapter, I want to cover one more aspect of my new way of life that came in. Like a few of the others, I had no way of seeing this one coming. Unlike the train that came at me through the work week, this one had the opposite effect. I was just going about my day-to-day life, and I received a call. It was our pastor, the pastor we had before Pastor Brett. He was going to take a trip in a couple weeks and wanted to know if I would fill the pulpit for him. Whoa, me? Offer the sermon on a Sunday morning? I wanted so badly to have a great reason to tell him, no, keep looking. But there was a problem. I didn't have a reason to tell him no. So I told him yes, and I hung up the phone, and I wondered what I had just done. Over time, I was asked to fill in more and more. I was just rolling along, but looking back to that time in my life, that was one incredible blessing. So I'll end this like I've ended all the other chapters. God has blessed me. Yes, He has. And I returned home each day to Julie and now our 2 boys. And it's easy to see our blessings if we just pause long enough to take a look. Into the next chapter we go.